All right, everybody, welcome back. Bio Bros episode 3. This is the Ariums episode. Terrariums, Vivariums, Paludariums, Ripariums, Aquariums, all that. We're going to go into a little bit of history of each one, kind of what the words themselves mean, some fun facts about them, just some general discourse about all of them. I'm here with Alex, as always, and
Hey,
we got Harrison with us as well, again from last week, if you caught that episode. So,
so
we're going to start off with Vivarium. The sounds a little backwards because vivariums you think would come after like terrariums and aquariums in order of operations, but vivariums are actually anything that has life in them. Just the common usage is a little different, so we'll go into that a little bit too. Anyone want to take a bit of the lead on vivariums?
sure. Um, so arium is Latin for like things being connected or like employed in, or it's a place for something basically. So viv, obviously meaning life, is it just means it contains life. So something that is a container for life is a vivarium. So a lot of people often will use vivarium as a a blanket term for their bioactive enclosures. They keep dart frogs in their vivariums. They'll even shorten it to vivs. Like, these are my vivs. I have a bunch of planted vivs at home or something like that. When in reality, your aquarium is just as much of a viv as those terrariums. So terrarium, polydarium, riparium, aquarium, all that stuff are just various kinds of vivariums, things that contain life. But yeah,
Yeah, so I have a bunch of notes for aquariums we'll get into later, but aquarium originally, before we got that word, was aquatic vivarium, and then eventually they came along and shortened it to aquarium. So vivariums are everything. Again, common usage, like Harrison just said, is mainly people are talking about bioactive. Bioactive kind of means you're creating a full ecosystem in there. You got plants and bugs and all that helping you out, keeping a full balanced, so to speak, ecosystem in a tank. But vivarium, if it's got something alive in it, it's a vivarium. Even if it's as small as like bugs and a little plant, that is a vivarium technically. Uh, Alex, anything you wanted to add on vivariums?
Yeah, they so basically, yeah, like they just reiterating what they said was basically anything you keep life in. It could be as big as a gigantic bioactive tank or as small as a little terrarium that you just keep moss in. Or a little box of you just keep moss in. As long as it's a container that you keep life in, it is a vivarium.
Yeah, so as much as we thought that this might be a deeper topic, because vivariums, they're super popular right now. Everybody's going into the bioactive vivarium thing. Actually, the most basic one. All the other words, aquarium, terrarium, paludarium, all that, are actually the more specific ones. So we'll kick it with the first one, first real ones here, kind of aquariums. So the earliest known people to keep fish in any capacity were the Sumerians about 4,500 years ago. Also, some records from Egypt and Assyria of the same thing, but that wasn't very successful. They were kind of primitive ponds. They were more of ye old refrigerator. You could keep the fish alive in there for a couple weeks before you ate them, and they wouldn't go bad, whereas if you just, like, killed them at the river, they wouldn't last that long and be fresh. But the Chinese raised carp as early as 1000 BC, and those were the first people to have any success with aquaculture, kind of. They were able to breed them and keep successfully these fish, which eventually ended up turning into our goldfish and koi and things like that when they moved when that practice moved its way into Japan and they kept them more ornamentally. So, a little interesting fact there. But this one that I think is actually the most interesting is the first people to keep marine fish were the Romans. And again, more primitive ponds, but they had like dudes just going back and forth with buckets, refilling salt water into these ponds to keep these saltwater fish alive. Still not a ton of success, but they were doing it, which pretty crazy, really, I think.
Yeah, and I imagine that would be the worst job because moving 5-gallon buckets of water is hard enough. I don't even want to imagine moving thousands of gallons of water back in the Roman times from the ocean to whatever pond they're keeping them in.
Yeah,
Yeah, that'd be fun.
No.
yeah. Hey, it does make me wonder a lot about, like, what they were really doing. Like, was it similar to what the Sumerians were doing? It was just kinda like ye old refrigerator, where they're just keeping them alive temporarily to eat them later, if they were actually, like, really keeping them as pets and ornamentally, I don't really know. This is just quick research on the history, and it brought me to this, and I thought it was a lot more interesting than I thought it was gonna be, really. Um,
It
but
sort of
now let's
reminds
get in.
me of, like when you're a kid and you go to the beach and you like carve out a little section of seawater and you catch stuff and put it in there. Imagine if that's like your whole life. Like you just own a giant piece of property in Rome that's near the ocean. Like I'm sure you could figure out a way to have pets if you wanted them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I bet there was someone out there who was, like, able to kinda do that, but really interesting. Maybe we'll have to do a full episode on the in-depth history of aquariums and try to get to the bottom of some of that stuff. But now let's move on from ponds, which technically could be a vivarium, place for life, but let's get into what we're actually here to talk about is aquariums. So this started in England in the 1700s with goldfish as the first real known aquarium where they're kept in glass. You can see them above ground. You're not looking down at your fish in ponds. This is you could have this on your table at your house. Still not very successful. Uh, Apologies if I butcher this name. His French name, not great at those, but Jean Villepreux Power invented the first glass aquarium that is kind of modern. You would recognize that as an aquarium in 1832. Still not a lot of success though. This is just a box of water, and if you've kept fish and things before, you know a box of water doesn't quite make the cut. You need some more stuff in there. So that was when the 1850s came around, and they figured out that plants create oxygen and fish need oxygen, and that created the first successful aquariums, which were planted aquariums, which I think is really cool because nowadays we think planted aquariums is a little more, high tech and harder to do, but that was the origins. The very first aquariums were planted aquariums.
That's really interesting because we have this like revolution of bioactive enclosures that rely on isopods and springtails and healthy plants to absorb all of these elements and things that are broken down by those bioactive or not bioactive, but your cleanup crew. And in reality, it originated with them using those things as necessity. So they didn't have that type of filtration. They didn't have the ability to understand what was going on and what was causing issues. So they went back to what is nature doing and how could we make that happen. And now it's all coming full circle and going back to these bioactive systems.
Yeah, that's super cool. Uh, and then this is when we're getting to the point of public aquariums becoming a thing. uh, Late 1800s, early 1900s, public aquariums started to become a thing. And this is when, like I alluded to before, the term aquatic vivarium kind of died out, and the word aquarium was created by Philip Henry Goss. And we have the word aquarium now, which is obviously a specific type of vivarium, an aquatic vivarium. And that's been in common use ever since then. But electricity is what really changed the game. When electricity became common in households and cities and things, then we were able to really start successfully keeping fish because people were able to make filters and bubblers and all that to be able to keep fish how we do now, which is kind of cool. You can still find some of those old relics from back in the day when it was very primitive, and it is similar to how we do it now, just a little outdated. I'm sure
Yeah, I
you guys
still
have
hear.
like some of those old meta frame tanks and stuff.
But yeah, no, I still hear like my girlfriend's parents, for example, used to keep aquariums when they were younger, basically, and they'll come down and visit and say, where are your bubblers? Where are your air stones? Where's all this stuff? Because 20 years ago that was all the rave, and it's funny to see the trends that come and go with keeping animals and animal husbandry and aquarium husbandry and all that kind of stuff. How It started with what is now considered to be the best of the best. But it's just everything comes into popularity and dies out and comes back into popularity. It's wild.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's super
kind of like a circle, full circle, basically.
yeah, as much as things change, they stay the same. But here's my last kind of point, and then we'll get into some just discussion about it because it's kinda neat. I didn't realize that this was even an issue until I was doing my research for this episode. In the 1950s, the plastic shipping bag was invented, and that really changed the game because now it was before it was limited to pretty much fish you could breed and then hand deliver to somebody. So the selection was not a lot of more native species, especially in America. You see old posters and things of aquarium shops, and it's a lot of US native or relatively close to the US native species like mollies, platies, and
Florida
guppies. And that,
flagfish.
yeah, Florida flagfish and goldfish that eventually made their way over here too. Really easy to breed stuff because you kind of had to hand deliver it. But then these plastic shipping bags, they invented those, and still what we use today, you go to a fish store, you get them in one of those bags. That allowed for real imports. And so my grandpa was one of the first got some of those first African cichlids to come over into America at about that time because he was into fish and saw these beautiful, like, reef-looking fish, but for freshwater, and I didn't even realize that perfectly coincided with that plastic shipping bag. So now fish keeping could go worldwide. You could have fish from any country in the world and any other country in the world because of the bag.
Yeah, that's
That's
wild.
actually really, yeah, that's really cool, actually.
Yeah, I didn't realize how important that was to fish keeping at all until then. But yeah, so aquariums, uh, I know that one was a little more historical than like true aquarium because I feel like everyone kind of knows what aquariums are. Everyone's seen to have an aquarium at some point. Everyone's gone to somebody's house who's had an aquarium. Everyone knows a little bit about them, so I was like, let's go a little more historical on it. Let's get some neat information out there.
Get down to the nitty gritty.
Yeah, so real deep stuff here. But the aquarium's super cool. Did not realize some of that. Some of the things were as important as they really were. But again, aquatic vivarium. If our guy, what was his name? Philip didn't come around, we would still be calling them aquatic vivariums.
Hmm.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah, super cool stuff, and that gives us a good one to go right into, like, the paludarium or the riparium as well.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
so, Harrison, you keep a lot of paludariums and have set up a lot of, like, ripariums and stuff.
absolutely. It's my favorite vivarium type. But
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
so what
yeah.
constitutes, like, a paludarium? Like, what does that mean?
So for a long time, polydarium has kind of been a blanket term for something that has a land and a water section. But as Alex, in a group chat where we talk about animals and plants and stuff all the time, pointed out, we were both googling it because we were curious about the Latin origins and the roots of the word. Polydarium it comes from palus, which is like a swamp or a wetland type situation, which of course is going to have both aquatic and land sections. But it really like emphasizes the type of situation because before it was just land and water, but now wetland makes it slightly more specific. And then riparium is specifically the area where a river meets the land, so it's more so focusing on the margin as opposed to the land area itself. So, like riparian plants would be marginal plants. Like in America, we have not necessarily pond lilies, but we have what's it called? The geez, this is gonna kill me. The arrowheads. They call it what duck.
green aurum.
The wait, what?
Green aurum.
I don't know about that one, but
Oh yeah, no, that is it is an arrowhead. We actually have it native here to North Carolina, like where I work at a lake. We have it all over the lake. It's covered in green aurum, and it's these
oh,
big old arrowhead plants. Not the one
I'm
you were talking about, I don't think, but.
I pronounce it arum.
Arum?
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Let me see. Duck. I'm googling stuff right now. Broadleaf arrowhead is Sagittaria. Jeez, I don't know why that took me so long. Sagittate leaves are some of my favorite leaves, but we have like Sagittaria latifolia. We have Sagittaria australis, which is funny enough extremely invasive in Australis. They used to call it Sagittaria appalachiana, but I believe it got the name Sagittaria australis because it's an invasive species there. And then we have stuff like Peltondra and stuff like that. But they're basically these big arrowhead shaped plants that grow right on the edge, and they grow in that accumulated, detritus and stuff that comes between um, a fast flowing river and the bank on the far side. So riparian mainly focuses on the plants that grow marginally, as opposed to focusing on wetland type situations where you have a clearly defined land section and a water section like a paludarium. And that's the main difference, basically.
And Alex, you work at the lake. You're there every day. Like you see kind of both of those in nature all the time, right? Like you would say they are different because I know a lot of people use paludarium and riparium almost interchangeably, where they'll call something that's obviously looking like a riparium a paludarium because it's got water and a bit of land. But you see that in nature. And is there truly a difference between like a what you would call a paludarium and a riparium if you were trying to recreate it?
yeah. I mean, to be honest, they're completely different environments because like we have creeks that feed into the river or into the lake, which I would the sides of the creeks I would almost think would be more like a riparium because they're obviously not a river, but they're close. And they're completely different environments because like even like the water movement is completely different from both of them. Um, where because like in creeks it's normally fast flowing, rivers too, fast flowing water with a lot of oxygen and things like that versus a paludarium, which would be like a marshy, more and like a lot of times people when you look at a paludarium build, they have water movement, but it's not a ton. It's like a drip wall or just like a slow water movement like it would be in a swamp. Um, and they also support completely different life, which I won't really get into because we'll be talking about that all night. But in like nature, they're completely different environments, different animals stay in different niches in the ecosystem.
Yeah, so and then we'll round out the last one with terrarium. So obviously terrarium, terra, earth, you know, or land vivarium would be a terrarium. But common use on that one has kind of switched over to terrarium. Normally, you're referring to like a sealed enclosure, like you're getting a glass bottle, putting a cork in it, and never or rarely opening that ever again. That's usually what people are referring to when they say terrarium nowadays, or they're referring to something with no animals at all or invertebrates. I hear a lot of people say terrariums for their inverts, which I don't know, to me it's kinda weird. Why do they have to be in terrariums but not vivariums when that's kinda the common use? But
Yeah, I've noticed that too.
yeah,
But terrariums actually, so like just getting into the history of them, the first terrarium was actually made on accident. It was back in 1842. It was by an English botanist, Dr. Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward is his name. Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward. And in 1842, he was actually raising moth pupae in a sealed glass jar. And during his research, he noticed mosses and ferns starting to grow and thrive inside of this sealed glass environment. Um, Essentially becoming a true terrarium because it does today a lot of people refer to terrariums as like just a plant only enclosure, but in reality a terrarium would be most of your enclosures that you have animals in, um, because vivarium covers them all, but terrarium is technically uh, at least just going off of like the first one ever invented would be like a yes sealed but also sometimes just a normal tank that has both plants and animals thriving in it.
one of my other favorite terrarium like pieces of information ever is the Wardian cases. So obviously named after our man Nathaniel, is Wardian. Uh, they use those to ship plants across the seas on boats, like back to England and Europe. They'd go to the exotic lands back in the old explorer days, and they put them in the Wardian cases because they needed that extra humidity and stuff, and they'd ship them on back. So those were around for a long time too. Like it's kind of interesting, our hobbies have been that we think of as fairly modern, or actually been nearly the same since the 1800s.
Like crazy how people see the things nowadays, and they are basically the same as back when they were first invented. Main differences being like new technology, new innovative ways, and easier automated systems and things like that. Obviously, they didn't have that kind of stuff back then. And basically, back then, their type of lighting was the sunlight. But nowadays, obviously, we have all different things like lighting and things like that. But it's still cool to see how the roots of the beginnings of these things are still part of this hobby.
Yeah, it's super cool. So I think we covered the technical side of things. We got our history done. Now, everyone knows that vivarium means very little, and you should, if you want to be more technical, use all the different technical words, even though nobody's going to, and nobody should really shame you for calling your tank a vivarium. And you're like, well, what kind of vivarium? You're like, no, dude, it doesn't really matter. Like,
I
it's
will shame you
okay.
guys.
Yeah. uh, but it is nice to have good words about all that. Like, be a little more specific, narrows it down a little bit. So we're getting into just some general discussion about like how these actually work and a little more unscripted now. So the terrariums are mostly going to be like your reptiles and things like that. Like your bearded dragon will live in a terrarium. Your snake will live in a terrarium. Um,
Anything without water is a
yeah,
terrarium, typically.
Yeah,
yeah. So nothing with a big pond or anything like that. Like anything on land, terrariums. I still call it vivarium just because that's common use. Like I would say, I'm working on a vivarium for my bearded dragon right now. I wouldn't say I'm working on a terrarium just because of common use, even though terrarium technically would fit better.
It sounds odd at this point. Like it's become habit to use vivarium when you're talking about your like animal enclosures.
yeah, it's almost like a slang for it at this point. Kind of how like a lot, obviously down in the south, everyone says "ain't" and "y'all." Um, and it almost once you've gotten grown up with that and like gotten used to saying that, it feels weird just saying "you all" or "are not" and things. No, I mean like it's almost a slang.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's almost like when we're talking about animals specifically. Like if the conversation, or if say it's a group chat about specifically animals, where we're not specifically talking about enclosures types, um, you'll be like, "Oh, I'm working on a new viv for my frogs," or "I'm working on a new viv for my geckos," and that may be a polydarium, it may be a terrarium, it may be blah blah blah, but it's a quick way to kind of you know
Cover 'em
say
all.
yes, and it sounds cooler.
yeah. And I think that history of it being the terrariums starting off sealed, and then for insects too, I think that kind of has something to do with how we word it. Because you say terrarium, so many people think of sealed terrariums.
Right.
Yeah,
I think,
Sealed, sealed terrariums are the bane of my existence.
same.
I, yeah, I work at a plant store where we also have like a little what we call a terrarium bar where we have like instructions on how to design your own little teeny glass terrarium. And we don't recommend that you seal it. Like it's not a good idea. It's not necessary in most cases. And people have this idea that they want to come in and they want to have this sealed terrarium that's going to last many many years. But when you get down to it, the famous sealed terrarium comes from David Latimer from England, and he started that thing in 1960. So it's been around for a very very long time, and people fail to realize that that was just a giant glass orb with dirt and a single cutting. It was a Tradescantia. I don't know what kind of variety, but a single cutting of a plant. So you're not going to start with something that looks nice and end up with something that still looks nice. Like if you're going to do a sealed terrarium, it has to be such a bare bones setup and a simplified setup, and you've only got to use one species, and it's all this stuff. And it's so doing a self-sustaining setup is so different than what so many people think it's going to be that it becomes tiresome explaining that.
Yeah, and even that really famous one is it's ugly, really. If you want it to look nicer, open it up, trim it up a little bit, it would look nicer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Like,
and if
it's
you
not
also
a
you get
display piece, just cool.
yeah, and you also get the other side where, like me, where every time I've tried to do a terrarium, or not terrarium, yeah, a sealed terrarium, I've done one species, done the minimalistic, and they always mold. No matter what I do, I won't water, like I won't overwater it, won't underwater it, just put a little bit of water. They always just mold, and then everything dies.
The classic,
Yeah.
yeah. Uh, but yeah, I think Harrison is not right, but paludariums are definitely some of the funnest to build and work with. I've got one right next to me right now. Needs a little love, but it's awesome. They look so cool. Like they're just so different that they're awesome to have in your home. And we'll get into that next episode. A little hint into next episode. It's going to be about like bringing nature into your home and not being ashamed of having pets and tanks in your house. But they're awesome. They're super cool. If you've never looked into paludariums at all, like, get into that. They're awesome.
Well, they're also like where the way people use the term totalitarian today, it's like the perfect combination of an aquarium and a terrarium. Because like most people when they're doing paludariums are basically doing half aquarium and then having above the water they're doing plants.
Yeah, that's
Now
how
that's not
mine is right
always the
now.
case. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's not
mine's about
always
a
the
third
case.
water, no substrate in it at all, or just some pots
Oh,
in the
that drives
background.
me nuts. Oh my god. The people who
Yeah.
always do like a plant wall with like a single piece of driftwood coming out the surface and then it's just an aquascape down below. And they never put a proper background on it so it looks like an actual shadow or something like that. But there's so much and that goes back into the misinformation thing where a polydarium is supposed to be a certain type of um, simulation of a specific environment. Like it's become this idea where it's got some land, it's got some water, so we don't know what to call it, so we call it a polydarium. But in reality, most of those setups are just plant walls with an aquarium at the base. It's not a true polydarium. It doesn't simulate a wetland at all. It's more close to a riparium where the upper section is maybe a lithophytic species on a rock wall, but not a true polydarium.
Yeah, like true politariums would be like where you get into a lot of dirt frog keepers do it. They'll just do like a little shallow pond in while all your soil and everything is just higher up than the water level. But that little pond or like just area that keeps the whole area kind of like or there's like water level, but it's just below the soil. That's more of like a true polydarium.
Hmm.
Versus like you were saying, where they basically do a plant wall and then an aquascape underneath, because that's not essentially a like you said, that's not a paludarium. That is just a plant wall with an aquascape below it.
Yeah,
Right.
and pretty much same deal. Like nobody's gonna freak out if you call your tank a paludarium and you're like, well, technically it's a riparium because it doesn't. It's like, no, dude,
Yeah,
good
no,
enough. But again, if you want to be specific and you want to talk and use the right words, yeah, riparian, the riparian zone. Like Google that, you'll see that in biology class. Talk about the riparian zone, little
yes,
graphics, stuff,
There
and
you
poster.
yeah. They and other thing with like ripariums, getting into that. Um, most people when they think of riparian setups, they're not like a true riparian setup because a true riparian setup, at least in my mind, y'all correct me if I'm wrong, would just be like a shallow water that you like basically put pots in or put plants in, and it's not like super deep or anything like that. It has decent flow and everything in it. Versus what a lot of people call a riparian setup, which is an aquarium that they have stuck plants just in the top of it so that their roots are going down into the aquarium that is aquascaped.
Yeah, the classic toss some pothos in the top of your tank. Now it's a riparian.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah, no, you're absolutely right because if you're doing a riparium, it's focusing on the riparian zone, as you were saying. So it wouldn't, you know, entirely include the main stream or the main river or something like that. It'd be focusing on the area where the stream meets the land. So that section of shallow water, like you're talking about, where the flow isn't crazy high like it would be in the middle of the river, but there's still some circulation, and there's just very, very dense plant growth in these, very dense sections of plants before it meets the land. And nobody really does that now that you're thinking of it. I've seen a handful of biotopes for specifically labyrinth fish, like betas and stuff like that, where they
Hmm.
have this just very, very, very densely planted um, setup with a lot of immersed plants, a lot of grasses and stuff like that growing up and out of the surface, lots of botanicals on the edge, which is what you would see on the margins of a river.
Hmm.
But very often, like for my personal uses, my riparium setups are focusing on an aquascape, but still allowing plant growth to develop in the back sections of the tank. Which is like it has a riparian aspect to it, but it's not a true riparium like you're
Yeah.
talking.
yeah, actually talking about that, I've been thinking about getting a beta or something for my paludarium, my that's right next to me in my room here. Just because I don't have any fish in there right now. It's just essentially what most people call a terrarium because there's no animals in it. But after this episode, we know that's not correct. Um, but that might be cool to actually put some like grasses and things growing directly out of the water and try to recreate that like habitat in there. That might be kind of fun.
Yeah, for sure,
Do
dude.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Especially if you
I'll
did
have to
like a
film it,
instead
toss it
of
up on YouTube.
yeah, and instead of doing like like one of the like Pet Smart or Petco betas, I can't remember their scientific name. Um,
Beta
but
Splendid.
yeah, beta splendids. Instead of doing one of those, you could always do like one of the wild species. Like they
The
call
Yeah,
wild
them
those are
type.
my
ill.
favorite.
Yeah, they call them like alien betas or something like that.
I
The
don't know
best
about
ones are beta chanoides though.
Those
Like
are yes,
Chionoides is so cool, and then Macrostoma is that classic.
yeah.
that's the
Do y'all
classic
know what the species
wild
is
beta.
that they're calling like the alien beta or whatever? It's a
Looking it up.
wild species.
I'm
Yeah,
looking
I'll
it
look
up
it up.
right now. Sounds like it's a hybrid.
Oh, okay, that's what it was. Yeah, it is a hybrid. I remember that now.
What's a
Because they
hybrid? I
call
think it's
them wild
London's
betas, but
hybrid
they
though.
aren't true wild betas.
Yeah, it says alien betas are a hybridization between different types of wild types. Um, yeah, it
So
says.
we don't even know what these are? These are just a random hybrid?
I mean, this is off a quick Google search, but it sounds like there's somebody. Realistically, probably somebody produced a handful of really cool looking betas, called them alien betas, and now people are trying to recreate it by hybridizing random wild types or something.
Something like that, probably.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Here, I found a little more information. So, it's according to Google this one, they got some good words in here. A meticulous amalgamation of beta embellus, beta smaragdina, man, I can't ever pronounce that one, and beta mahachai.
Hmm,
So, it's
that's
a
unusual.
it's a
You
flower
find
horn
a
situation. It's a
yeah.
we don't really know. For those unfamiliar with the flower horn fish, it's a hybrid of South American cichlids. Nobody really knows what it is. There are some good guesses, but nobody really 100% knows what these things are.
That is interesting though, because like you don't see a ton of hybrids in the hobby that are more than just two species together.
But yeah, I am happy about the back to a little more positive. We're not gonna be correcting everyone all the whole time here. I am happy about like the word vivarium, like even being a thing nowadays, because like the reason we even had to make this episode is because of all these different words being thrown around. We're like, you know what, we should clear up some confusion on all this because not long ago everything was either a terrarium or an aquarium, and most part people are right. But now we've got vivarium, paludarium, riparium, all these things like all these words being thrown around. So that's progress in the hobby. We're keeping everything better. We're getting more specialized. The level of education in the general person is higher, which means everything is going to be kept better and nicer and just improve and improve and improve until we're in a really good spot.
Oh yeah. Technical
Oh yeah.
technology is necessary for proper communication. It's the same thing with the plant world, where not everything is a lithophite. There are chasmophytes. There are all sorts of different things, and I mean, not to get too nerdy, both of you guys know what I'm talking about, but having the proper word for a lot of people think it's just unnecessarily complicating things, like, oh, technically it's this. But if we all just learn these, there's 5 words, like for real, 4 or 5 words, or sorry, 5 or 6 words: vivarium, aquarium, polydarium, riparium, terrarium. If you just learn them, it makes communication with other people so much more clear, and then you can concisely talk about what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that kind of ties into like what I wanted to talk about next was like when you're when you are learning these and actually saying what the thing you have is and knowing that it is what you were saying, like a paludarium or a or a terrarium or aquarium. It helps when you like even choosing an animal to put in there because not every
Right.
animal can go in to each other, vice versa. Like we were talking about the other day, I would love to do a paludarium setup. Absolutely would love to do it. The species I keep, though, only one of my species would I feel comfortable putting them in there, and that'd be my white tree frogs. And other than that, you can't do arid species in there. So like my bearded dragon, my leopard geckos, they're all out. You really can't. Well, you got to be really careful with paludariums with what species you pick because like if I was to put my crested geckos, and we all know the intelligence of crested geckos, I would be worried to put them in a paludarium because in my mind they would slip and possibly fall into water and drown. And that's something you have to really be careful about and talk or like know the terminology of what you're talking about because if you have a paludarium and you're just like, "Hey, I have this vivarium set up. What animals can I put?" It could be a completely different list than what you could actually put in a paludarium safely.
Exactly. Yeah. It
Yeah.
just it elevates the conversation to a point where everybody understands exactly what you're saying, and you don't have to go into detail about stuff.
Yeah, like, this stuff is, like, necessary for leveling up, you know? If you're just a really basic hobbyist and you just wanna kinda get into things and just something you enjoy and it's not something you're ultra, ultra into and wanna learn a ton about, doesn't really matter, but if you wanna level up a bit and get into more specialized things, at some point, you're gonna have to really want to learn all the little nuances and differences between things so you can talk to other people who are higher level and get that communication down.
So you
And
can
kinda like Alex was saying, not every species is good in everything. Uh, like, I was looking into Amazon milk frogs for a second, and they almost have to be kept in a paludarium. Like, that is how they want to live. They love that water and kinda land area. It's how they breed, it's where they live in the wild. If you find them in the wild, they're probably gonna be over water, but also not in that riparian zone. So, knowing all those different little words is gonna help your research for your new species that you wanna keep even easier too.
and it makes it easier to you're saying research the species, but also research the type of enclosure that you need to build. So, you for ripariums versus polydariums, you'd be using different substrates or potentially different isopod species. And then the same is true for polydariums versus terrariums. If your substrate is going to be drier because there's not going to be an aquatic section or something like that, you would potentially use different types of soil. You'd be using different types of isopods, different types of springtails, and it all becomes very complex. And so the vernacular that you're expanding by learning these words becomes a necessity, essentially. Um, like you could get away without knowing these words, but it just becomes so much more simple if you do know the words.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
and
really, if you're listening to this and you're this deep into it, you're pretty nerdy and you want to learn all this stuff, so keep go like, that's that's what we're here for, you know? Like, one of my goals when starting this thing is I wanna be able to, like, take somebody from day 1 and 10 years in and have them kinda learn something and take something out of it and have it be cool, so, like, the title and everything of this video is gonna kinda bring in, less it's gonna be more attractive to a less experienced crowd who doesn't already know this, and by the end, it's like, "Oh, well, I know a lot more things about it," and even seasoned veterans, like, the vivarium thing, I still call everything a vivarium.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
You
I
got
think
any
that kind
closing notes? I feel like we're just starting to ramble a little bit anyway.
of
Yeah.
Not a crazy, not as in depth of an episode, but pretty in depth anyway. Interesting zone that we were in here.
Oh yeah, and we'll have other episodes too, where we talk more specifically about each type of setup, and like how you could do it, and like what animals you could put into it, and things like that.
Yeah,
But
this
those will be
one's
future episodes. This is just kind of like an overview of it all.
yeah, overview of everything. If you don't know, here it is. If you do know, there maybe you learned something cool. Like I was very interested in all that fish stuff. I didn't realize how long we'd been keeping fish. I thought maybe a few hundred years,
Oh
but
yeah, and like I never knew that carp, like koi and goldfish, started in China. I always just assumed it had started in Japan because they were so famous for keeping them, and they're so famous today with their $1 million koi.
Yeah, all the best Japanese or all the best koi and goldfish tend to come from Japan now. But all that stuff
Yeah,
originated in China. It's crazy. Like you got the story of the Dragon's Gate. A lot of the what are they called? Like not stories, but more so than a story, like a folk tale type stuff that you have in Japan is based on these Chinese stories of like koi and goldfish and climbing up waterfalls and stuff like that and turning into dragons. It's weird.
yeah, that all that history is so cool. Like how all this like seems little and small. Like reptiles and fish are not a staple conversation in normal conversations, but it really is. Like they really affected our culture and all that a ton.
No, for sure.
yeah.
Uh, so I think that about wraps it for BioBros episode 3, all the Ariums. We'll catch you next episode and have a nice day, everybody, and see you later. Remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel and all the Instagrams and everything like that will be linked in the description of this. And leave a comment, do whatever you need to do, and have a good one. Catch you on the next one.
Bye, guys.